Welcome, friends, to another episode of 1PM. We're really excited to be collaborating with Becky from Becky's Notes, a UK-based resource to produce an infographic for our visual learners out there. Becky's Notes bring together all the key topics medical students need to know in a readily available place, reviewed by specialists in the field. These visually striking notes are a refreshing change from all these boring textbooks out there. You can check her out on Instagram at Becky's Notes 01 and support her at the links below.
Welcome to 1PM. We've got two special guests today. We've got Alex and Renae.
I am Alexander.
Sorry, I can't even introduce the right name.
Hey everyone, it's Broska here today.
Hi, Broska. What a sick
Broska.
intro. Hey.
Yeah. Oh, funny guy, huh?
Yeah.
Clown.
Okay, Broska, what are you teaching us
All right,
about
so
today?
today's going to be a little bit different, and the main focus of this is we're going to be discussing antipsychotics.
Nice.
So what we're going to be looking at is the different types and how they relate to their effects, both in addressing psychotic symptoms of like schizophrenia, as well as the side effects that they each hold. And I'm not sure about you guys, but this is a consistently examined piece of content, and I found it very difficult to remember all of them without having a little bit of a biological basis. How does that sound?
Grand.
Yeah,
Grand.
So
That does not sound very grand. So give us the first principles.
All right, so the first of all we're going to do is we're going to begin by talking about the major pathways involved in psychosis and the chemicals that are involved within these pathways. These include dopamine and serotonin. Then we're going to briefly touch on the different receptors, which are also impacted by antipsychotics and are responsible for a lot of their side effects. So we're thinking histamine, muscarinic receptors, and alpha-adrenergic receptors.
Nice.
Nice.
Let's go.
And then after that, we're going to just discuss the differences between typical and atypical antipsychotics and how they relate to their effects. So when we begin, is anyone aware about the major pathways involved in psychosis?
Nope.
It's interesting. So maybe I'll start naming them. So the Mesolimbic, Mesocortical, Tuberoinfundibular, Nigrostriatal. These sound familiar? These ring any bells?
Somewhere.
Yeah, very nice.
My anatomy was never really a strong suit. I
Yeah,
think.
what's your strong suit, Jason?
Nothing, actually.
Yeah.
Nothing is my strong
I beg to differ. He has the perfect face for a podcast.
Yeah.
Perfect face. Wow, that's...
Yeah.
Oh, he got me good. Wow.
Got his ass.
Wow.
So,
See the
Alright.
tears running down my face now.
yeah,
Keep
this is a
going.
content heavy.
Yeah. Oh man, a lot of first principles here.
This is never going to air.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So,
these four regions. Go.
so these are 4 pathways involved. These are considered like the dopaminergic pathways, but they also use other receptors, as we'll discuss. So the first one is the Mesolimbic pathway, and what I want you guys to remember about this one's the pathway responsible for the positive symptoms of psychosis.
And what are those positive symptoms?
Well, does anyone have any ideas about what the positive symptoms are?
Hallucinations, delusions.
Nice. Yes, they are the positive symptoms. So what happens in this pathway is dopamine activates the dopamine receptors. And in normal people, this is typically involved in the regulation of reward and motivation. And unusually, activation within this pathway by excessive dopamine is responsible for the behaviors and perceptions of people with schizophrenia, such as those positive symptoms. So the way I think about this is like limbic, mesolimbic pathway. Limbic is kind of responsible for like emotional.
So mesolimbic, emotions, dopamine.
Yeah.
What's the next
Yeah,
one?
so mesolimbic, emotions, positive symptoms, hallucinations and delusions. And then we got the mesocortical pathway, and this is responsible for the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Does anyone know what they are?
The 5 A's.
Oh yeah, nice.
Oh, go through them.
Oh God. Apathy, asociality, anhedonia. Yeah, okay. That's all my brain's
That's
giving
3
me.
out of 5 A's, if I'm not mistaken. What are the other 2?
Yeah, so there's so it was asociality, anhedonia, apathy. There's also like affect,
Yep.
so like low affect, like they're very, you can kind of see on them their emotions that are quite dulled. Then there's alogia, so logos, you're thinking language, and then so they're not speaking. And then there's avolition.
Do you have too much dopamine in mesocortical?
So in this pathway, The key receptor involved in the mesocortical pathway is the dopamine receptor and the serotonin receptor. And dopamine release in this region is responsible for normal cognitions and affect. And under normal circumstances, serotonin, what its function is to kind of keep the dopamine release in homeostasis. So it inhibits dopamine when it gets too high. So serotonin inhibits dopamine, and then together they keep each other in equilibrium.
Yeah.
And then, so we're thinking mesocortical, cortical, it's responsible for cognitions, affect.
So summarize, so mesolimbic emotions, mesocortical is the 5 A's.
Correct.
Oh, wait.
The
You
negative.
could simplify it.
Okay, so mesolimbic is responsible for what?
Positive symptoms.
Positive symptoms, and it's mainly
Dopamine.
And in case of psychotic people, is it high or low?
It's very high.
Very high. And then in mesocortical pathway, they have actually, conversely, they have very low dopamine.
Okay. And that's responsible for the negative symptoms, which are the 5 A's.
Yes.
Sweet.
So they have very low dopamine, the mesocortical, responsible for the 5 A's. Then we got the nigrostriatal pathway. Does anyone know what this is?
Be completely wrong, but that's all your extrapyramidal side effects.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Something to do with the
Big
substantia
word.
nigra.
Big word. What's
Yes.
extrapyramidal?
Your 4 are acute dystonia, akinesia, akathisia, and tardive dyskinesia.
So basically muscle shit, right? And they're all
Essentially.
yeah. So tardive dyskinesia, what's that again?
I think
Is it
tardive
the tongue?
dyskinesia is the tongue one.
Yeah, the tongue one. Wait, so what did you say, Renae? So you got tardive dyskinesia,
Tardive
which is
dyskinesia.
abnormal tongue movements, pretty sure.
Yeah, it's mostly face and I think upper limbs.
Yeah.
Akathisia is kind of restlessness and inability to sit still. Akinesia is pseudo-Parkinsonism. So you get your Parkinson symptoms, essentially.
Yeah, which are like the pill rolling tremor.
Yep.
They love that. And what else? The
Cogwheel rigidity.
cogwheel rigidity, yes.
Yeah, so that's actually, it's interesting you mentioned. What has cogwheel rigidity? What's that a common symptom of?
Parkinson's.
Yeah, so the nigrostriatal pathway is a pathway which projects into the substantia nigra, which is the pathway involved in
Parkinson's, yes.
Yeah. So then you get those kind of Parkinsonian symptoms.
So in psychotic patients, do they have too much or too little dopamine?
So in psychotic patients, you're not actually, like, without this pathway will become more relevant. We're talking about antipsychotics.
Okay.
In terms of this pathway, just in normal psychotic patients, I don't see it as super relevant.
Okay. So could you think of so what's that region called again? The
Nigrostriatal.
nigrostriatal. So that's more related to movement.
Yeah. So this region mediates different motor movements.
Okay.
And
So
so a lot of
nigrostriatal.
And yeah.
Yeah.
And the key receptors involved in this pathway are dopamine receptors. So and then there's a final pathway involved that's relevant to this discussion of antipsychotics, and it's the tuberoinfundibular pathway. And does anyone know what this is?
Yeah, from memory, the infundibulum joins the pituitary gland, and then its relevance beyond that, I have absolutely no idea.
That's pretty
It's
good.
better
That's good
than me,
enough.
right?
Wait, that's good enough. So the tuberoinfundibular pathway is the pathway that regulates the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary gland. So in this pathway, dopamine acts to inhibit the release of prolactin. So high dopamine levels would inhibit the release of prolactin. It's usually relevant to like pregnant women. So you'll have like the lactation. If you have high prolactin, it also decreases fertility. So if you have high prolactin, you can also expect that. So now, okay, so we've done that. So we've spoken about the 4 major pathways. To quickly summarize,
Yeah.
so what are the 4 pathways?
Okay.
Mesolimbic system. Positive symptoms of psychosis, high dopamine.
Yes. And okay. And what okay, so in mesocortical, what are the 2 chemicals that we're focused on?
So the mesocortical pathway is dopamine and serotonin, and it's responsible for the negative symptoms of psychosis. So your 5 or 6 A's.
And is there high dopamine in the mesocortical pathway?
There is low dopamine.
Nice. There's low dopamine. That's responsible for the negative symptoms. And then we have the nigrostriatal pathway. What do you guys remember about that?
So that's
Parkinson's.
Parkinsonism. So that region is more related to the antipsychotic side effects, because low dopamine in that region can cause Parkinsonism symptoms such as tardive dyskinesia and akathisia. Okay, what's the last region?
Okay, and then
Summarise
there's
it.
the tubular-infundibular pathway, and what is this?
So the tuberoinfundibular pathway, again, dopamine is the primary inhibitory molecule. The pathway isn't that relevant for psychosis, but it is more relevant when considering the side effects of antipsychotics down the line. And it's to do with the release of prolactin by the anterior pituitary gland.
All right, so the rest of that was probably the most content. That's like the real struggle.
That was real first principles, man. You're
I
really
know,
scratching
I know, it fucking sucks.
You're really
All right.
presenting to the
It
theme of our
sucks, I know,
show,
it
man.
A Reg told me about this, and he made me remember everything. So
Yeah.
let's see if it works. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about just receptors that are usually activated by antipsychotics, and this should be a little bit more straightforward. So histamine receptors are one of the types of receptors that are involved, and they're usually antagonized in antipsychotics. And so do you guys know what's the function of histamine generally?
Just allergies.
Yeah, degranulation of mast cells and the activation of the...
Yeah, so
Can you politely fuck
it's
off?
responsible for wakefulness.
Degranulation of mass. Oh my god.
Yeah, 'cause
Do you want
when
to
I
go through the atoms
Actually,
next,
no.
or-
Technically, no. That's IgE, which leads to degranulation,
technically.
which
That's what I was-
releases lysozymes, which are full of histamine.
That's
You're
exactly
full of
what I was
shit.
thinking. I was about to call you out on that. I was going to be like, so embarrassing that you thought it was to do with the degranulation of mast
Okay.
cells.
Degranulation.
Yeah. So it does a bunch of things. It's
Inflammatory mediators. That's the level I know.
Yeah.
I'm going to stick with allergies.
Yeah, allergies are good. Also responsible for like wakefulness and alertness and appetite. Do you guys know about, if you were to antagonize histamine, now maybe you can think about allergy medicines to think about some different side effects of this, but what are some side effects?
Sedation.
Sedation, nice.
You get pretty sleepy.
Get pretty sleepy. You know what else you get? A little bit hungry.
I didn't
Apparently
think
you
that.
do. Maybe on really high levels.
So hunger and sedation.
Yeah.
If you block a histamine receptor.
Okay. And if you're hungry, then what could happen?
You eat a lot,
And then what happens?
gain weight. Oh, so that's what. Okay.
No, it's only part of the story.
Oh, it's only part. Okay.
All right. So now we've got muscarinic receptors. They're also activated by antipsychotics, and they're antagonized. So yeah, muscarinic. Let's think about it for a second. So
Yeah.
what's the major like chemical involved?
So you like block the parasympathetic pathway in a lot of things.
Acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine.
Yeah. So it's acetylcholine, and it's involved in like a bunch of things, including like your heart rate, so your vascular system, as well as like your gland and their secretions. So if you were to antagonize it, what that would be doing essentially would be lowering your parasympathetic system and increasing your sympathetic system.
Yeah, so
Yeah, so just-
parasympathetic pathway usually stimulates saliva secretion, right? So
Yep.
would you get a dry mouth then?
Nice, yeah, you get a dry mouth. So the main like anti-muscarinic effects that you get in
Yeah.
antipsychotics would be things like dry eyes because you're secreting less stuff. And then we got alpha adrenergic, so
Blood pressure.
that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so blood pressure, so they can get like postural hypotension. And then
Wait, so
also-
to summarize here, so alpha adrenergic receptors are on the
So
blood vessels
Yes.
and cause vasoconstriction when activated. So if you inhibit that, it can cause vasodilation.
yeah,
which-
nice. So you get
a
postural
drop in blood
hypotension.
pressure. Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you get?
Drop in blood pressure.
And then you can also get QT prolongation, which I'm not going
shit.
to, and that's from the alpha
That
adrenergic
one.
effects.
That's why it was called.
So,
Okay.
So maybe just remember that. Nice. All right, so now we can talk about antipsychotics, the thing we've all
Mate,
been waiting
the
for.
build-up is real, hey?
I know, I've been teasing with
yeah,
the talk of
better-
receptors. Let's get to the good
Yeah,
stuff.
can you actually give me something which I can answer a consultant's question with?
Oh no, none of this lecture will help with anything. This is I can just tell them what the previous exam question was. And it's not galactorrhea, all right? All right, so there's first generation antipsychotics, also known as typical antipsychotics. Does anyone know anything about them?
From memory, they affect dopamine release, and so you tend to get your typical low dopamine side effects such as extrapyramidal symptoms and suppression of the mesolimbic pathway.
The big
Very
boy
nice.
answer.
That was good. So these first generation or typical antipsychotics, they primarily just target like dopamine receptors.
Can you give an example?
So here are some examples. So there's haloperidol, droperidol, chlorpromazine. Zuclopenthixol.
Hey, two's enough. Haloperidol. That's what I'm going to
Flupenthixol.
remember.
Guys, you're going to want to rewind. You're going to want to really remember those.
Haloperidol. Okay, let's
So
go.
Yeah.
Well, promazine, zuclopenthixol, and flucopenthixol.
It's flupenthixol.
Yeah. Well, look, they don't tend to use that one. Ignore it.
Yeah, I've
Haloperidol.
never heard of it.
Okay,
I
I'm
don't
going to
even know
remember
what
one because that's my standard, just one.
Yeah.
Haloperidol.
All right. So they block dopamine receptors. So in the mesolimbic pathway, what would be the effects?
Oh, so lowering the amount of dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway is going to decrease the positive symptoms of psychosis, which is what we're trying to do in
good.
schizophrenia.
Very good.
Mm.
Man, he's
Yeah,
very
so-
suave with the mic, eh?
Yeah, he's good.
Why is he
good
talking
mic.
full sentences?
Yeah. Why don't you
Very
stutter
offensive.
more? Why don't you stutter more and then think about how the saliva in your mouth is sticking to the
Sorry,
roof of your
some
mouth?
of us are exhibiting anti-muscarinic effects, some more so than others.
Yeah. So yep, they're really good at positive symptoms. So now let's think about it in the mesocortical pathway, the blockage of dopamine. Can someone remind me, in the mesocortical pathway, what's the receptors involved? And yeah, Renae, how does dopamine relate to symptoms of schizophrenia?
So you get your dopamine and serotonin are your two big ones. And then in the mesocortical pathway, you get decreased dopamine, which gives you your negative symptoms.
Yeah, so if you had antipsychotics that decrease dopamine further, what would be an issue that we might encounter?
Just worsen your negative symptoms.
Yeah,
Make them feel worse.
make them feel worse.
Convince them that they're going to feel better.
Yeah, you
So
convince
more
them. and-
pronounced negative symptoms. eh?
and you convince them, and if
Big
you can't
words.
convince them, what do? You fawn them. no, sorry. I'm sorry.
Oh my
I'm
God.
sorry. Okay. And
Spoken like
You're just making
spoken like a PGY 20 site consultant.
All right, so. All right, so yeah. So the issue with first generation or typical antipsychotics is in the mesocortical pathway. Since they decrease dopamine, they can worsen the negative symptoms. Now, nigrostriatal. Does anyone want to have a... Jason, why don't you give this one a shot?
Yeah. So you're reducing the dopamine in the nigrostriatal region. Then that leads to the Parkinsonism effects because dopamine has an inhibitory function on muscle movement.
Very good.
Smooths it out.
Is that A plus? Yeah,
It's an A+.
that's a
There's a HD.
yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go.
It's a HD and it's a firm pat on the back from Broska. So blocking dopamine in the nigrostriatal pathway decreases inhibition of the muscle movements and results in those extrapyramidal symptoms that Renae mentioned earlier without a mnemonic, which is very impressive.
Yeah.
I have a mnemonic. So the mnemonic is ADAPT, and it's acute dystonia, akathisia, Parkinsonism, and tardive dyskinesia. And I think that mnemonic is really good because as well as telling you what the extrapyramidal side effects are, it also tells you the order in which they occur temporally. So like acute dystonia, it's the first one you'll see, and so on and so forth.
So right now, the typical psychotics or first generation are good for mesolimbic, but bit shit for mesocortical and...
I think what you're trying to say is that they are relatively effective at managing the positive symptoms of schizophrenia and psychosis, but due to their effects on dopamine and the relationship between dopamine and serotonin within the mesocortical pathway, it leads to an exacerbation of the negative symptoms.
I need Alex to stand next to me whilst I'm doing my Oskies.
I think you'll just take your job. You're kicked off. the podcast.
Mesolimbic, bitch, good.
So nigrostriatal pathway involved in muscle movements,
Yeah.
and then in first generation or typical antipsychotics, you have dopamine antagonism. So you get decreased dopamine.
Yeah.
That results in decreased inhibition. And then at the most extreme end, you can get one of the most concerning side effects of typical antipsychotics. Does anyone remember what these are?
Neuroleptic malignant syndrome.
Very nice.
What is that? Is that like a seizure or something?
I'm just going to drop another mnemonic. Psych is just mnemonics.
Nothing what you need.
Psych is mnemonics and then memorizing the 1 p.m. Anki flashcard deck that we're going to put up on this topic. So the mnemonic for it is malignant fever with a capital M
That's a lot
and then a capital
That's
fever.
a lot of letters.
It's not, the alignant part is not part of the mnemonic.
Okay.
It's,
It's fever.
yeah, so it's, the M is myoglobinuria. So you're thinking like they're
You're pissing myoglobins, yeah.
very good. Then you
Nice.
get the F is fever, which is nice. The E is encephalopathy. And then the V is vitals, so unstable vitals. And then you get the E is for enzymes, so increased enzymes. And then the R is rigidity, so muscle rigidity.
Yeah, it's
Doesn't matter
good
too much.
buzzword to know. So, the
but yeah.
extreme end of, so if you like, would you say if you overdose someone with antipsychotics, they could be at risk of neuroepileptic malignant syndrome?
Yeah, so you want to watch out for this one because in typical antipsychotics, because they're blocking this inhibition in the nigrostriatal pathway, they can cause neuroleptic malignant syndrome, which is, I think about it as like
Yeah.
their just muscles are really rigid because they're so activated and then they destroy themselves.
Yeah.
And then that will kill your kidneys.
It's bad for your kidneys. And what are your kidneys? No.
No.
Okay, and then in the tuberoinfundibular pathway, so what would the dopamine blockade do? in
An
the dopamine?
increase in prolactin.
Very good.
Because dopamine has an inhibitory effect on prolactin secretion. Is that right?
I'm so proud of you guys.
Yeah, fuck. This actually is making sense.
It's all coming together.
It took a good bit of time,
Yeah.
but you know
Listeners,
what?
if you're here, you should see the size of the light bulb that has appeared over Jason's head.
Yeah.
It is one of the few things actually bigger than Jason's head.
Oh. Boing, 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 boing. Destroyed. Eliminate him.
You just invite Alex. on the
Cringe.
episode.
Jason cringe. Sorry. It's so stupid.
We're keeping that in,
Just
right?
try to invite a new
Keeping
guest
it in.
onto the
In fact, that's
episode.
the entire podcast.
They just bully you.
All right. So all of those things. And then we're done. All right. So yeah. In summary, typical or first generation antipsychotics. They block dopamine. In the mesolimbic pathway, this addresses the positive symptoms of psychosis, so the hallucinations and delusions. However, in the mesocortical pathway, this blocking of dopamine worsens negative symptoms. In the nigrostriatal pathway, this blocking of dopamine results in less inhibition of motor movements, and then downstream from that, the extrapyramidal symptoms and potentially neuroleptic malignant syndrome. And then the tuberoinfundibular pathway, this blocking of dopamine results in less inhibition of prolactin. So you get prolactin increasing, galactorrhea, gynecomastia, and menstrual irregularities.
Nice.
All right, so now we're on to second generation antipsychotics.
The new boys, hey?
Yeah. So these are a little bit different to the first generation antipsychotics. The key difference in them, and this is a bit complicated, but don't stress too much out
Better
about the
fucking
details.
simplify this, man.
Well, I can't simplify it. So the second generation or atypical antipsychotics, they block serotonin receptors and dopamine receptors. And this is different because typical antipsychotics, they didn't affect serotonin receptors. And in atypical antipsychotics, though they do block dopamine receptors, the affinity for dopamine receptors is much lower. And some examples of these include, clozapine, olanzapine, quetiapine. So they bind strongly to serotonin receptors, bind loosely to dopamine receptors. So now let's think about this in terms of the mesolimbic pathway. What would we expect?
So the mesolimbic pathway, you are going to get a reduction in positive symptoms.
Nice. Yeah, very good. All right. So,
You gone to mesocortical.
so yeah, with second generation or atypical antipsychotics, they block serotonin in the mesocortical pathway. This results in less inhibition of dopamine. So you get higher dopamine. This treats the negative symptoms. So a big difference between first generation and second generation antipsychotics is that second generation antipsychotics treat negative symptoms as well as positive symptoms.
Damn.
All right. So so compared to typical antipsychotics, because the dopamine only binds loosely with atypical antipsychotics, the effects on the tuberoinfundibular and the nigrostriatal pathway are way less. So Jason, what are you likely to...
So when compared with typical antipsychotics, atypical antipsychotics will have less side effects related to Parkinsonism and prolactin-related side effects.
Yeah. So much like the typical antipsychotics, the atypical antipsychotics do also impact like the histamine receptors, resulting in like the increased appetite and the weight gain associated with histamine activation. But because of the inhibition of serotonin, deregulates glucose and insulin metabolism. And
The metabolic side effects.
very good. But that's actually where, so although histamine can cause increased appetite and weight gain, it's kind of negligible compared to
The serotonergic effect.
Yeah. So, yeah, atypical antipsychotics, they have a high risk of metabolic syndrome, so diabetes and whatnot. All right. Okay. So, in summary, there are 4 major pathways involved in antipsychotics. They're the mesolimbic, which is responsible for positive symptoms, mesocortical, which is responsible for negative symptoms, the tubular and fundibular pathway, which is involved in prolactin release, and the nigrostriatal, which is involved in the extrapyramidal side effects of antipsychotics. And in case of psychotic people, there is high dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway, and then in mesocortical pathway, conversely, they have very low dopamine. There are 2 different types of antipsychotics. There's typical and there's atypical antipsychotics, or first generation and second generation antipsychotics. So with typical antipsychotics, they work mainly just by blocking dopamine. In the mesolimbic pathway, this addresses the positive symptoms of psychosis, so the hallucinations and delusions. However, in the mesocortical pathway, this blocking of dopamine worsens negative symptoms. In the nigrostriatal pathway, this blocking of dopamine results in less inhibition of motor movements, and then downstream from that, the extrapyramidal symptoms and potentially neuroleptic malignant syndrome. And then the tubular and fundibular pathway, this blocking of dopamine results in less inhibition of prolactin. So you get prolactin increasing, galactorrhea, gynecomastia, and menstrual irregularities. In atypical antipsychotics, the main way it works is it strongly antagonizes serotonin receptors and then weakly antagonizes dopamine receptors. And this is different because typical antipsychotics, they didn't affect serotonin receptors. And in atypical antipsychotics, though they do block dopamine receptors, the affinity for dopamine receptors is much lower. So they bind strongly to serotonin receptors, bind loosely to dopamine receptors. They block serotonin in the mesocortical pathway. This results in less inhibition of dopamine, so you get higher dopamine. This treats the negative symptoms. So a big difference between first generation and second generation antipsychotics is that second generation antipsychotics treat negative symptoms as well as positive symptoms. All right, so compared to typical antipsychotics, because the dopamine only binds loosely with atypical antipsychotics, the effects on the tubular and fundibular and the nigrostriatal pathway are way less. And the main other difference between them and typical antipsychotics is because of their serotonergic effects, they can affect insulin and glucose metabolism, resulting in metabolic syndromes.
Nice.
And is that it? Yeah, it's fine. All right, I don't want to talk about this anymore.
Well, thank you everyone for making it to the end of the podcast, and I hope you've learned a little something about psychosis and some of the medications that are used to treat it. Make sure that you review and follow our podcast and stay tuned for further episodes.
Nice.
Like
Thank
and
you, thank you,
subscribe.
guys.
Like, subscribe.
Comment,
Broska's
share with
entire
everyone.
personality and sense of wellness and self-esteem comes from these reviews. So
Yes,
do it for
very
do it
important.
for
Do it
Broska.
for
Can't see it, but I have bloodshot eyes and I'm
Yeah.
I'm sobbing behind the mic.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Nice.
Let's have
Thank you,
fun.
guys. Thank you for coming on as special guests today, Renae and Alexander, and Broska, I guess.
Oi, funny cunt, huh? Oi, cheeky.
No, thank you, guys. Thank you, guys, for coming on. Appreciate it. Cheers. Till next time.
Till next time.
Dun dun. Okay.
Do you guys want to do Vertigo now?
Oh, fuck.
This is never going to air.
Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. It helps us get discovered and helps more medical students with understanding their first principles. Check out 1pm.wiki, and for all your first principles, keep it right here at 1pm.